listener production.
Hey, Sacha Barbour Gatt with you. Welcome to the Briefing's Best of Summer series, where we're bringing you some of your favourite deep dives from the last 12 months. And today, we're talking about something most Australians would be somewhat, if not very familiar with, Temu. Amid the cost of living crisis and our love for a bargain, it comes as no surprise the online retailer, which sells everything from t-shirts to toilets, is used by more than 1.2 million Aussies every month. But at what cost?
The global fashion industry relies on a system of entrenched exploitation. We know that workers are working incredibly long hours in potentially unsafe conditions to make the items of clothing that you're wearing right now.
In the second half of this ep, we'll be revisiting my chat with Sarah Rogan from Oxfam Australia. First, though, here are the headlines straight from the Listener Newsroom on Monday, the 23rd of December.
Good morning, I'm James Lake. There's a timely reminder about Christmas tree decoration safety after a Melbourne home was destroyed by fire yesterday. Authorities say it was sparked by overheating lights left on a tree. Victorian tourism operators estimate they're already losing $2 million a day from lost business because of raging fires in the state's west. The Grampians are still recovering from blazes which damaged livelihoods back in February this year. And at this stage, authorities are predicting the massive fires there to keep burning for another 3 to 5 weeks right through the summer holidays. Airfares would be fairer under a new Charter of Rights, which Canberra is proposing for travellers. Transport Minister Catherine King says one of the main ideas being flagged is ensuring cancellations don't leave customers in the lurch.
If they have flight cancellations, they should expect at no cost of their own to either be rebooked on that airline or another airline, or they should get a refund within 14 days.
A post-Christmas interest rate cut by the Reserve Bank's now looking even less likely thanks to our strong jobs market. The RBA aims to keep inflation between 2% and 3%, though a target it's only achieved for 15 months over the past decade. And Aussie medical researchers say they've developed a groundbreaking new jab which could reverse blindness. The gene therapy uses the retina's own stem cells injected back into the eye to repair photoreceptors. Let's hope the treatment can help with both diseases that take away vision as well as age-related degeneration.
Thanks to the Listener Newsroom for those headlines. Next up, we're getting into my chat with Oxfam Australia's campaigns and advocacy lead, Sarah Rogan. This chat was initially part of a 2-part series which we published back in May. And if you want to listen to part 2, just search Temu in our podcast and it'll be there. Online juggernaut Temu is Australia's most popular free app, offering a vast vortex of low-cost merchandise from fashion and homewares to toys and electronics.
Temu, all of my wishes came true. Shop like a billionaire. Shop like a billionaire.
Who could resist the call to shop like a billionaire? And adding to the allure are games to win discounts or coupons, personalised recommendations for you, and free shipping from China. But amid all the thrilling rush of retail therapy lie some pretty serious questions. Where does this stuff come from? What are the conditions like for those at the bottom of the supply chain? And with everything wrapped in plastic and racking up serious air miles, what about the environment? Today I'm joined by Sarah Rogan. She's the campaigns and advocacy lead at Oxfam Australia. Sarah, thanks for your time today. Look, Temu has become hugely popular in Australia. We're well known for loving a bargain. Cost of living isn't helping either. You know, people need to buy stuff, I get it. But there are ethical concerns, and that is around the potential exploitation of the workers for Temu in China. What do we actually know about the conditions for factory workers who are part of the supply line?
The global fashion industry relies on a system of entrenched exploitation. We know that workers are working incredibly long hours in potentially unsafe conditions to make the items of clothing that you're wearing right now. Fast fashion has become a part of the regular way that people consume clothes, and we know that the workers are mainly not paid enough to live on. They're not paid enough to meet their daily needs for a decent life. Things like being able to afford rent, food, going to the doctor when they need to. All these sorts of things are not possible under the system of exploitation that workers face because they are not paid a living wage.
We're talking about Temu in this case, workers in China, but Temu's not alone, right? There are so many other brands that are participating in questionable ethical practices, aren't there?
Yeah, that's right. Brands like Temu and Shein are part of a model of ultra fast fashion, which just churns through things so incredibly quickly. And we know a lot about fast fashion. We're quite familiar with that. But what we're seeing with these other brands is just things happening so quickly. And you've really got to question what's happening with the workers when they're being exposed to such need for things so quickly. But there are many brands that we've been watching for quite a few years. We've been involved with conversations with them about trying to do better within their supply chains. And we are seeing some improvements. There are brands that genuinely want to do better, but it's part of a huge system globally of questionable purchasing practices, of a lack of transparency, and of brands who are not yet paying living wages.
We know this as consumers, I suppose, at a base level. I'm sure there are some consumers out there who are perfectly oblivious to what goes on when it comes to making and receiving their clothes. But last week we did see this footage kind of go viral, and it's unverified, but the poster claims it's from a Temu factory in China. It shows this line of shirtless men at conveyor belts frantically rushing through these packages that are just in their thousands, just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them piled on top of each other. It's pretty shocking, and I suppose it made a lot of people stop and think about how they could be contributing to that, whether they're shopping at Temu or somewhere else. What impact do you think footage like that has when things like that go viral? Does that impact consumer behaviour at all?
It does, for sure. We know that consumers are concerned about where and how their clothes are being made and how the people, mainly women who make their clothes, are being treated. We've been having conversations with consumers for many years now, and we know that brands care about what their customers think. And we really encourage people to be conscious consumers. We don't want them to feel guilty about where they shop from or buying from the brands that they love, but we want to see people using their power as consumers to demand brands do better. There are many ways that people can demand that brands do better. They particularly pay attention to what's going on their social media feeds. And so brands do listen to what consumers have to say. And also, it's been 11 years since the Rana Plaza factory collapsed, and we really did see a change in consumer behaviour, or at least awareness about what's going on in the fast fashion industry after that tragedy 11 years ago. And things improved in factories, particularly in Bangladesh.
What about the environmental impact as well? I mean, not much of what we buy is made in Australia, especially fast fashion. What environmental impact does that have when it's all this plastic, it's all this packaging, then it's being put on a plane and shipped across the world, and then it's being put in a truck and driven around? Like, the carbon footprint of this industry must be ginormous.
That's a good way to put it. The carbon footprint is enormous. It's one of the most polluting industries in the world. We see the whole cycle of fast fashion from the dyeing mills to the cotton spinning right through to being thrown out so quickly and dumped in places like desert in Chile or in Ghana.
You know, you say that consumers, especially in the last decade, have been more focused on buying ethically, trying their best to get their clothes and their goods from ethical sources. However, a lot of that relies on transparency from those companies themselves. What work is being undertaken to ensure that companies like Temu and Shein and others are being transparent with how their supply line works?
Transparency is hugely important in the garment sector. And when we're talking about transparency, that's about naming the names and locations of their supplier factories. And so that's publishing on their website all of the factories where they source their clothes from. And this transparency allows for independent auditors, for trade unions to be able to know where the factories are, conduct their inspections, to be able to talk directly to workers so that they can know what's going on in the factories. We've been calling on Australian brands to to be transparent for a number of years now. And of the 19 or so companies that we're watching, the majority of them are transparent. And that's sort of happened within the last 10 or so years. And that's hugely encouraging. That's brands like Kmart, Cotton On, Best and Less, those Australian brands, and also some of the international brands like H&M. They do publish the names and locations of their supplier factories on their website. This is a building block to work towards being an ethical brand, a building block to working towards living wages as well. And the brands that have released the names and locations of their supplier factories have predominantly done that for tier one, which is where the clothes are made. And then there's other tiers within the supply chains as well, like the cotton mills, the dyeing factories. That's the next step in the process, and we're calling on brands to do that as well.
What about in China? We know it's hard to get information from Chinese companies and factories. Temu and Shein operate out of China. Are they showing any indication that they want to be more transparent?
With China, it's what we don't know that's the problem. We see media reports and investigations that come out that are often undercover, they're unverified. It adds to our knowledge about what's going on, but we can't independently verify it. But what we do know is that China has a long way to go when it comes to respecting the rights of working people. China hasn't signed really important human rights conventions. For example, they haven't signed the International Labour Organisation's core conventions on forced labour, on protecting people's rights to bargain together in their workplaces, or the right to join and form a union. So the right to freedom of association is severely curtailed in China.
Temu says its values include integrity and being socially responsible. Does that really mean anything in this case?
I can't comment directly on Temu, but what I can speak to is the brands that we're looking at, I believe, are really trying to do the right thing. Some of them are restricted by the system, and so what needs to change is how brands are doing their business, how they're doing their purchasing practices, which is how they go about negotiating with the factories to deliver on the products. What we want brands to do is to separate the costs of labour from the costs of doing business. So when they're negotiating with factories on delivering a particular product, actually ring-fencing wages from that discussion. So the wages component is not compromised when trying to get brand factories to deliver products quickly.
Look, before we let you go, Sarah, we're talking about consumer responsibility as well. Should we consider boycotting companies like this that don't want to be transparent, that we know that there are ethical questions, very serious ethical questions around their practices? Does boycotting work? Is that something we should consider?
With specific reference to the fashion industry or the garment sector, we don't advocate boycotts. They may result in workers losing their jobs. The garment industry is a huge part of the economy in the countries where the clothes are made, and we actually want this to remain the case. We want women to have that empowerment of being able to work, and being paid in the garment sector is the way that can happen. What we'd love consumers to do is use their voices as consumers to demand that the brands they love do better, and really continue on their journey to paying workers a living wage.
I do my very best not to buy from non-ethical sources, and something like Temu and Shein I've avoided just because for me there are more questions than answers, and I don't feel comfortable supporting a brand like that. Does that mean that it would actually be not better, but is it almost better for me to be shopping there so that I'm in some way actually supporting jobs for these women overseas?
What we'd like people to do is look at the brands on Oxfam's What She Makes company tracker. You can see how brands are tracking on their transparency, on their commitment to a living wage, on whether they've done other things like separating those labour costs, or whether they've investigated what the current wage is and the difference between a living wage, and whether they're making a plan to bridge that gap. We want people to be conscious consumers. Absolutely only buy things from op shops if that's the way that you want to buy your clothes. But then we know that the vast majority of people will walk into a store or see something online which is pretty cheap, and that's their price point. That's what they can afford. And so we're not discouraging people from doing that. What we're encouraging is people to look a little bit deeper into what's going on in the supply chains of the brands that they love or the brands they shop from. And they can do that by Googling What She Makes makes, and there's a list of the brands that we're looking at, and then you can see how they're tracking on the What She Makes website.
Sarah Rogan, thanks so much for joining us today and for talking us through that topic. Definitely a complicated one, but it seems like we've made some good strides, but lots of work left to be done.
That's exactly right. Happy to be here. Thank you.
That was my chat with Oxfam Australia's Sarah Rogan from May there. At the time, Temu did respond to our series. Its full statement is in the description of this episode. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing's Best of Summer series. Thank you so much for listening. If you could share this deep dive with someone you think might enjoy it, we would absolutely love that. And if you want to keep up with our other content, we are on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. And we will be back in your feed with the headlines from the Listener Newsroom and another Best of ep at 6 a.m. tomorrow. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.